Hey, I'm going to be talking about groundwater and some couple of new things that we're going to be looking at if you haven't heard of them already. It's groundwater at risk of containing pathogens and groundwater treatment objectives. And both documents are documents produced by the Ministry of Health. We've had input into them. They've had their people working on them. And they are, they've got information in them, they've got policy in them. They're documents which we must consider. And the GARP one is how you determine if your well's at risk of containing pathogen, and if you do determine it's at risk of containing pathogen, then how you might go about treating it. Here we have a nice selection of different wells, some of which, considering they came from our environmental health officers, might very well all be from community water systems. We've got a nice well on the banks of the river. We've got a couple of wells side by side there. The one with the blue opening there, it looks like, depending on how the concrete ring was constructed, it may have water access to it. And we have a nice drilled well that appears to meet all the requirements under the groundwater protection regulation. It sticks up above the ground. It's got a proper cap on it. It's got a well tag on it, so it has been registered with the ministry. And it looks like it also might have a monitoring well right beside it, checking depths of the water in it. Okay, so talk a little bit about what it is. We'll get into the specifics. We'll get into how they go together, and hopefully you'll have a bunch of questions for me, which I may or may not be able to answer, but can always get them for you. The historical way that we've dealt with groundwater has been that deep wells were generally considered safe, and often they were not disinfected. The best management practice for shallow wells, well, sometimes they'd be disinfected, but maybe not. We always considered groundwater to be safe. As the Walkerton showed, it can't always be. In 2005, the Ministry of Environment came out with the groundwater protection regulations, and that included standards on well construction, making sure you've got a surface seal, making sure you have a cap on it, registering it with the Ministry of Environment. From the Ministry of Health, we've had our new guidance documents coming out, and the ones that we're going to talk mostly about today are groundwater at risk of containing pathogens, or GARP, and the groundwater treatment objectives. There we go. That's what it looks like. If anybody wants to get their own copy, wants to read it themselves, we have updated our Island Health website, and we actually have some information on there that might be helpful to you. So I'll get you a link, but all these documents, there's a link back to the Ministry of Health page. Okay, so that's what the cover looks like. Under Section 5 of the Drinking Water Protection Regulation, which is under the Drinking Water Protection Act, if groundwater, in the opinion of a drinking water officer, is at risk of containing pathogens, it must be disinfected. Drinking water officers, those are the environmental health officers that come around and look at your water systems and do the inspections, make recommendations, require you to make treatment, whatever is necessary. Before you can tell if it's at risk of containing pathogens, you have to do an assessment. And the GARP guidance document does lay out all the steps that you go through to do it. One of them is an initial screening tool, and we'll see a little bit more about that later. So my hope is that when our drinking water officers come out, they'll do it with you, so that you're both looking at the same thing at the same time, and there's that chance for interaction. And well, we can say, well, based on, we can just check things off, but if we're there and talking to you and you're explaining it to us, you can say, well, that doesn't apply because of, oh, well, okay, well, that's not evident from just the thing. So having the conversation is always a good thing. Once you've looked at whether or not it is GARP, the stage 1 hazard screening and assessment, that's the It's a checklist. If you have certain things on there, it may be at risk of containing pathogens, and therefore you want to maybe look a little more. If there's no hazard present, you'll come down to the very bottom at low risk of containing pathogens. You might go to long-term monitoring, but it'd always be an ongoing thing that you'd always be looking at it. If something changes, you may want to look at it again and see if those changes are impacting your water. If you do the checklist, you might find there's more information required. You can do 3 levels of investigation, and depending on what you get out of that, you might again default to the bottom at low risk, or you might need to do a further investigation. If it's determined to be at risk, then is it at risk of everything, or is it maybe viruses only? Are there some things that you can do? There may be some things that can do, hazards removed, and then move to long-term monitoring again. This is from the document, and it's just a form that we generally fill out to give us a bit more information about your wells. Put the name of the system on it, we'll put the well name on, if there's a well tag number, a well identification plate on it, and in 2004, we came around and we did attach those plates to a lot of the wells, and we collected a lot of information which we shared with Ministry of Environment, which has gone into their BC Water Resources Atlas, which provides a lot of information about wells in the area and conditions. We would look at what information is available on the well's depth, how much water is actually in the well, what the casing is, and we try and do a little sketch of where it is, which might identify some hazards that might be there. This is the assessment, and it's a stage 1, and you would go through each of the parameters there. If you get reoccurring total coliform, fecal coliform, which we don't usually test for now, or E. coli, if you have those once in a while, you check off the present, which means you do need to do further assessment. You would look at all of those things there. One of the things that we find are most common is that the well construction isn't meeting the groundwater protection regulations. So if you don't have a surface seal and you're getting the odd bacteria in it, it might be that upgrading and putting a surface seal in might help it. So there are things that can be done. If you get everything with not present, then it can be considered not at risk of containing pathogens, and that means you won't necessarily have to treat. If you're finding some that are coming up in the present category, that triggers a further investigation, a more elaborate investigation. Once you've done the assessment, you can come up, it's at risk of containing pathogens or it's at low risk. This is what a properly constructed well under the groundwater protection regulations should look like, and this should be, any well constructed after 2005 should meet those. But you can see you've got a proper well cap on it. It's sticking up above the ground. It's got sloped away from the wellhead so that water doesn't pool around, have a chance of going in. You've got the surface seal at least 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters thick, and that usually goes down about 15 feet. If you're in bedrock, it will usually go down until you hit the bedrock layer. You've got showing the water level in the well, which they call a static water level, and the screen at the bottom, which allows the water to get in to be drawn up the casing through the pump. So once you've done your stage 1, you've filled out that form, you can come up with, if it came out you had no check marks in the present category, it could be considered at low risk, or it could be considered at risk. It might only be from viruses only, and there are a couple of indicators on there which would indicate that if you're within 300 meters of a source of viral contamination without a barrier to transport. So if you're in a sand and gravel aquifer and you've got sewage systems within 300 meters, that could be a source, probably the most common source, but there could be other sources. Could be viruses in a surface water if there's some connection with that as well. If it is at risk, you can start doing some of the mitigation options And we'll talk about that a bit more later. If it's at risk because you really don't know, you don't have that information, or it's inconclusive, you can move to a further investigation to get that information, which may support that it is at risk, or it may say, oh, no, because of this particular factor, it's not at risk. If it's at low risk, then you can move to the long-term monitoring. We've said that it'll determine 3 options at low risk, no treatment, and that might be just for the well. If you've got a really large distribution system, you still might require treatment in the system to deal with contaminants that could get in through the distribution. It could be at risk of GARP viruses only. That would require a 4 removal log of viruses, and the best way to remove the viruses is through chlorination. You can do it through UV. It's just that depending on what the activity is in and around your wellhead, that will determine what sort of viruses might be there, and each virus has a different sensitivity to ultraviolet. So if you're thinking of using ultraviolet irradiation, if you've got a hepatitis A virus, you need a lower dose. If you've got a lot of human activity in and around your wellhead and possibly contaminating your aquifer, then the adenovirus, which is from humans, it requires a dose of 186 millijoules per centimeter squared, which puts you up into a really, really more complex treatment system. If it is full at risk, it must meet the groundwater treatment objectives, and we'll get to that in a bit. So some of the things that you can do to mitigate risk if it's related to your wellhead itself, you can put a proper cap on it. And this is from the people at Forest Lands Natural Resource Operations, and they're photographs of some of the things that they have seen. We find all sorts of interesting caps on wells. This one's a bucket over top. We've seen rags stuffed in them. We've seen rags stuffed in with a plastic bag tied around it. For your dug well, there's a good example. I've noticed that a lot of dug wells are coming with almost like the sewage risers, the green plastic with a lid that can be locked. Excellent method like that. But again, here, you do have your plywood on top. You've got your rock on to make it difficult to remove the plywood to get into it, but you've got a hole directly through the plywood into it. Okay, so if you have identified a risk, some things you can do. You can upgrade your well construction, the things we talked about. You can find an alternate source of water. You can move to point of entry, point of use. We usually only consider point of use for a chemical problem. If you've got arsenic in the water, then having a unit right at the tap in every home would be acceptable, but we don't accept it for microbiological issues. So if you've got bacteria, viruses, or protozoa in your water, we wouldn't consider it. We would consider point of entry. That's where each home would have a device located preferably outside so that it could be accessed by the company contracted to take care of it for sampling, and it would treat all the water going into whatever standard or to whatever need it was showing. You can eliminate contamination sources, and that would really depend on what it is. You could move on and doing a further investigation, or you could default directly to whatever method of disinfection would be appropriate for your particular situation. Stage 4 is long-term monitoring. If you're considered at risk, you would need to do some sort of risk mitigation. And for a source to be considered at low risk, you have to make sure all the hazards are removed. Once it's low risk, you can move to the stage 4 long-term monitoring. And again, that's going to depend on what your issues are, what you would be doing. We do list the number of bacteriological water systems that should be submitted on a regular basis. what that might mean is if you've been doing once a week, maybe we might want to get more samples, or we might want to get them from different locations. We might get them directly as close as possible to after the source, or very end of the distribution system. There are a lot of different options, and each one is going to be specific to your particular situation. Now, if your well has been determined to be at risk of containing pathogens, and we can move on to what sort of objectives, what sort of treatments would be appropriate for treating your problem, your issue. So it provides guidance on microbial contaminants, and also if you are on the bank of a river with your well, there is a possibility that water can move in and out through the subsurface materials. Depending on what those materials are, it can also filter and take out some of the contaminants. There is a process, and I think North Cedar has done a full assessment on their wells. Yeah. And then depending on the results of that, it may say, okay, you can get filtration credits, in which case you wouldn't have to filter, but if it is necessary and you can't get those filtration credits, you're likely going to be looking at filtration to remove the small particles, which would allow filtration. Just a good example of your well beside a river. You've got it elevated here. This is actually from Kentucky. You've got it elevated so that it doesn't flood. You've got the huge caisson, just a huge collection chamber. It's got the laterals going out on top of the bedrock. You've got your sand and gravel aquifers. You've got a silt layer, so silt and clay layer, so things coming in from the top aren't as likely to get through and down into it. But you've also got your river or other surface water source that may filter through the sands and gravels and get into your collection area and be taken up. So if it is determined to be at risk of containing pathogens or viruses only, if it's only viruses, then you don't need two forms of treatment. You can often get away with one because you're wanting to have a minimum of 4 log removal of viruses. You still have to meet the 0 E. coli and total coliform. And as I said earlier, that chlorination is usually the most effective for removing the viruses. If it's not just viruses, if you may have protozoa or bacteria coming in, then you have 2 forms of treatment required. You may get a filtration deferral if, depending on what your subsurface materials are and how well they filter out what is coming through. And again, you need to have your no bacteria, a 4 log removal of viruses, a 3 log removal of protozoa, and less than 1 NTU of turbidity going out into your distribution system. Okay, if you are thinking that you might get filtration exemption because you have the riverbank there, it must meet section 4.3 of the surface water treatment objectives, and that is you would have to have about a year's worth of data with the turbidity. The turbidity sampled about, I think it's a minimum of 4 times per day, day in, day out, for a period of a year, and the average, you can't exceed more than 5 NTUs of turbidity for more than 2 days out of 1 year. So it's a pretty tough standard to meet. If you're looking at a surface water, it can be really, really tough. The well has to be properly constructed, protected, and it needs to have a wellhead protection plan. We do have some information available as well. The Ministry of Environment has a document, I think it's separated into 7 or 8 modules, but there's lots of really good information about it. And yes, you can just sit on the top of your wellhead and you look around 30 meters in all directions and say, okay, nothing there, we're good. It depends what kind of an aquifer you're in. If you're in fractured bedrock, those are the most vulnerable because you don't know where the cracks and crevices are that are feeding your well. If you're in sands and gravel, there are what they call analytical equations that can predict how things will travel and how long it will take to get to your water, to your wellhead. It's based on a lot of things, on the depth of the well, the depth of the aquifer, the type of materials, the pumping rate. There's a whole series of things that are taken into, but they can be done. You can still just sit on the top of your well and look around and check for obvious things and go, oh, where did that come from? Maybe neighbors put a chicken coop or something in, that sort of thing. So you can use that method, but for a community water system that is supplying other people, you might want to look a little beyond just an arbitrary fixed radius.